Queen Isabella landed on English soil with an invasion fleet, her teenage son at her side and her lover commanding the troops. Within weeks, her husband, the king, was a prisoner. Within months, he was dead. History would call her the she-wolf, but England called her regent. The grey waters of the Suffolk coast churned beneath 28 ships as they made anchor at Orwell. Horses stamped and whinnied as handlers led them down wooden gangplanks slick with spray. Foreign voices cut through the salt wind. Flemish commands. Hainaulter soldiers checking weapons and forming ranks on English soil. Isabella stood at the water's edge and breathed the air of the kingdom she had fled 2 years before. She was 31 years old. Beside her stood her son Edward, 13, the legitimate heir to the throne of England. Behind them both, ordering the mercenaries into columns, stood Roger Mortimer, her lover, her general, her co-conspirator in what the law would call treason. 1,500 men, a tiny force to conquer a kingdom. But Isabella was not counting on soldiers alone. She was counting on hatred. Hatred for the dispensers. Hatred for a king who had failed his realm. She looked toward the road that led to London and knew that every step forward was a step away from any possibility of retreat. If she failed here, she would die. Her son would die. Everything she had built in exile would be erased. But she did not intend to fail. The question that hung over that September morning was not whether she would march. It was how the daughter of Philip the Fair, a 12-year-old bride sent to secure peace between nations, had become the woman willing to destroy an anointed king. The answer lay buried in 18 years of humiliation. And now, before this story unfolds further, may I take a small portion of your time and subscribe to this channel. Join thousands of history lovers on this journey through time. If this tale has earned your attention, a like and a comment go a long way. Tell us, where in the world are you watching from? These stories have traveled centuries to reach you. Let us continue. 18 years before the invasion fleet touched English waters, a 12-year-old girl stood in the cathedral at Boulogne-sur-Mer wearing a gown heavy with gold thread and the embroidered arms of 2 kingdoms. Isabella was the daughter of Philip the Fair, the Iron King of France, who had crushed the Knights Templar and bent the papacy to his will. She had been raised in the Palais de la Cité, trained in Latin and diplomacy, shaped into an instrument of alliance. Her marriage to Edward II of England would end generations of war over Gascony and bind 2 crowns in peace. The groom was 23, tall, golden-haired, athletic. He spoke his vows clearly, but his eyes wandered. At the wedding feast that followed, Edward did not sit beside his child bride. He laughed and whispered with a Gascon knight named Piers Gaveston, touching his arm, leaning close, ignoring the French princess who bore his ring. The nobles of France watched in rigid silence. They had delivered a daughter of the most powerful dynasty in Europe into this marriage, and the English king treated her like furniture. Isabella watched too. She was 12 years old, alone in a foreign court, bound to a man who looked through her as if she were glass. The Chronicles record that she said nothing. She smiled when required. She performed her role. But something began that night in Boulogne. A careful observation, a slow understanding. The humiliation had started before the marriage sheets were even cold, and Isabella was already learning to remember. Edward II was nothing like his father. Edward I had been the hammer of the Scots, a warrior king whose very name made enemies tremble. His son preferred swimming in rivers, digging ditches, working beside common laborers. The nobility watched in dismay as their monarch ignored the arts of war and governance for the company of Piers Gaveston. Edward had made this Gascon knight the Earl of Cornwall, a title reserved for royalty. He had given Gaveston lands, castles, jewels. He had given him Isabella's own wedding gifts to distribute among his relatives. The teenage queen endured this in public silence. She was 15, then 16. A foreigner in a court where her husband's favorite held more influence than she ever would. The barons forced Gaveston into exile repeatedly. Each time Edward recalled him to. The pattern broke in 1312, when Thomas of Lancaster and his allies captured Gaveston on Blacklow Hill and took his head without trial. Isabella was 17 when she learned her tormentor was dead. That same year, she gave birth to a son, the future Edward III. For a brief, shimmering moment, hope seemed possible. The favorite was gone. The heir was born. Perhaps now her husband would see her. Perhaps now the marriage could become what it was meant to be. She had fulfilled her duty. She had given England a prince. Surely that would be enough to turn Edward's eyes toward his queen at last. The hope lasted only a few years. By 1315, Edward had found new favorites to fill the void Gaveston left behind. Hugh Despencer, the elder, and his son, Hugh the younger, rose to dominate the court with a ruthlessness Gaveston had never possessed. Where Gaveston had been careless and flamboyant, the younger Despencer was calculating, patient, endlessly greedy. He seized lands across Wales through forged documents and naked intimidation. He inserted himself between the king and every advisor, every petitioner, every voice that might challenge his influence, including the queen. Isabella found doors closing before her. Despencer controlled access to her own husband. He whispered against her. He stripped away her income and her allies until she stood isolated in a court that had become hostile territory. In 1321, the Marcher lords rose in rebellion against the Despensers. Their leader was Roger Mortimer of Wigmore, a battle-hardened commander whose family had ruled the Welsh borderlands for generations. The rebellion failed. Mortimer was captured and thrown into the Tower of London to await execution. The Despensers returned more powerful than before. But in 1323, something unprecedented happened. Mortimer escaped the tower, the first man ever to do so, and fled to France. Isabella heard this news in her increasingly empty chambers. She filed it away carefully. A proven commander. A man who had lost everything to the Despensers. A man with nothing left but vengeance. The trap around her was tightening, but perhaps there was still a way out. The opportunity came wrapped in crisis. In 1323, a dispute over the fortified town of Saint Sardos in Gascony erupted into bloodshed. French soldiers died. English officials stood accused. Charles IV of France, who had inherited the throne from his father Philip the Fair, demanded that Edward cross the Channel and kneel before him in homage for the English territories in France. Feudal law required it. Edward refused. He could not leave England while his grip on power remained so fragile. He would not humble himself before his wife's brother while the Despensers whispered that such submission would make him look weak. Charles responded by declaring Gascony forfeit and sending troops to seize it. War threatened to consume both kingdoms. Someone needed to negotiate. Someone who could speak to the French king as family rather than enemy. Someone the Despensers would be delighted to remove from the English court. In March 1325, Isabella sailed for France as her husband's diplomatic envoy. The Despensers likely congratulated themselves on the arrangement. The troublesome queen would be gone, unable to interfere with their control over Edward. They did not understand what they had done. They had sent Isabella home to the brother who loved her, home to a court where she held power and respect, home to freedom. She crossed the channel carrying her husband's instructions and her own private calculations. She would never willingly return to him. Paris embraced her like a lost daughter. Isabella walked the corridors of the Palais de la Cité, where she had played as a child, spoke French without the constant translation in her mind, moved through rooms where people looked at her with respect rather than suspicion. Her brother Charles welcomed her warmly. Here was family, here was safety, here was power. The negotiations over Gascony proceeded smoothly. A solution emerged that would satisfy honor on both sides. Edward II would send his son to pay homage in his place. The young Edward would be invested with the French territories, fulfilling feudal requirements while sparing the English king the humiliation of kneeling to his wife's brother. Edward agreed. In September 1325, the 13-year-old prince arrived in France. Isabella held her son close and understood exactly what she now possessed. Freedom from the Despensers, the protection of the French crown, custody of the heir to the English throne. Everything she needed. Letters arrived from England demanding her return. Edward commanded his wife and son to come home immediately. Isabella replied with words that chroniclers would preserve for centuries. She declared that she would not return while Hugh Despenser remained at court. She had married the king, not his favorite. She feared for her very life if she returned. The letter was defiance wrapped in the language of a wronged wife. It was also a declaration of war. Isabella was never going back, not as a supplicant, not as a prisoner, only as a conqueror. Roger Mortimer had crawled down the walls of the Tower of London on a rope ladder in 1323, the first prisoner ever to escape that fortress. He had drugged his guards on the feast of St. Peter, climbed through a hole cut in the stone, and vanished into the night. Now he haunted the French court, seeking allies for his vengeance against the Despensers. He was approximately 40 years old, battle-scarred, former lord of vast estates in the Welsh marches before the Despensers had stripped him of everything. He burned with the cold, patient fire of a man who has lost all and means to reclaim it. He was also charismatic, decisive, ruthless, and he looked at Isabella as no man had ever looked at her before. Their alliance began as politics, two exiles with a common enemy, but it became something else in the candlelit chambers of the French court. They were seen together constantly. They shared quarters openly. The chroniclers whispered of scandal and sin. Isabella was 30 years old. She had endured 17 years of a frozen marriage, 17 years of being ignored and humiliated and pushed aside for favorites who treated her like an obstacle. Now, here was a man who valued her counsel, who saw her as a partner, who touched her with desire rather than duty. Was it love or strategy or some fusion of both that the Chronicles could never untangle? The moralists of the age condemned her adultery, but Isabella had stopped caring what moralists thought. She had a rebellion to plan. Charles IV loved his sister, but he would not give her an army. Open war between France and England would be catastrophic. It would undermine his own position and invite retaliation he could not afford. Isabella needed another sponsor. She found one in Count William of Hainault, ruler of a small but wealthy territory in the Low Countries. The negotiation was delicate and brutal in its simplicity. William would provide ships, money, and 700 mercenary soldiers. In exchange, his daughter Philippa would be betrothed to the young Edward, future King of England. If the invasion succeeded, William's grandchildren would sit on the English throne. If it failed, his investment would be worthless and his daughter's prospects ruined. William was an ambitious man. He accepted the gamble. Through the spring and summer of 1326, the preparations intensified. Isabella pawned her jewelry to fund the expedition. Mortimer called in every favor from his years as a marcher lord, reaching out to disaffected English nobles who sent secret messages of support. Ships gathered in the harbors of the Low Countries. Soldiers drilled and checked their weapons. By September, the fleet was ready. 1,500 men, a pitiful force to conquer a kingdom. But Isabella was not counting on soldiers alone. She was counting on the hatred that had been building in England for years. In late September, the fleet set sail. Isabella stood on the deck watching the coast of Hainault disappear behind her. Her son stood beside her. Ahead lay England and treason, and either a throne or a scaffold. There was no turning back now. The fleet made anchor at Orwell on the 24th of September, and Isabella set foot on the estates of Thomas of Brotherton, Earl of Norfolk. This was no accident. Norfolk was Edward II's own half-brother, and he had secretly pledged his support to the Queen before she ever left France. The first defection came within hours. Then the floodgates opened. Henry of Lancaster rode to join Isabella with his retainers, burning for vengeance over his brother Thomas, whom Edward had executed years before. Other lords followed. Knights and barons who had suffered under dispenser greed came with their men-at-arms. The common people lined the roads to cheer the Queen as a liberator. No one raised a sword against her. In London, Edward received the news with disbelief. He issued proclamations declaring his wife and Mortimer traitors. He offered rewards for their capture. He summoned his vassals to defend their king. Almost no one answered. The years of favoritism had hollowed out his support. The military disasters had destroyed his reputation. The dispensers had made enemies of every powerful family in England. Edward watched his kingdom abandon him in a matter of days. Isabella's army swelled as she marched. What had landed as 1,500 men grew to thousands. Town after town opened its gates. Castle after castle declared for the Queen. The map of England was rewriting itself in real time, and every new marker showed another lord turning against his anointed king. Edward's reign was collapsing faster than anyone had imagined possible. Edward fled London on the 2nd of October with the dispensers at his side and the royal treasury loaded onto pack horses. They rode west toward Wales, where the dispenser lands might still offer refuge. Behind them, Isabella's forces poured into the capital without resistance. The flight became a nightmare of autumn rain and closing doors. Castles that had once welcomed the king now refused to open their gates. Retainers slipped away in the night, vanishing into the wet darkness rather than share their master's fate. The roads turned to mud beneath their horses. Supplies dwindled. Edward pushed toward Caerphilly, the greatest of the dispenser fortresses. but the Welsh lords who had once bent the knee now watched in hostile silence. Isabella's army moved with terrifying speed. Town after town surrendered at her approach. Bristol fell on the 26th of October, and with it Hugh Despenser the Elder, who had taken refuge behind its walls. They dragged the old man before a tribunal, where Roger Mortimer sat in judgment. The trial was brief. The verdict was predetermined. The next day, they hanged Hugh Despenser the Elder until he choked, cut him down while still alive, sliced away his entrails, and hacked his body into quarters. The sentence for treason executed upon the father while the son still fled through the Welsh hills with a king who had no kingdom left. The circle was closing. Every road led to capture. Every ally had melted away. Edward and the younger Despenser were running out of ground. They found them near L'Entresant on the 16th of November, hiding in the Glamorgan hills like common outlaws. Henry of Lancaster's men surrounded the fugitives, and there was no resistance left to offer. The King of England stood before his captors, disheveled and hollow-eyed, exhausted beyond defiance. Beside him, Hugh Despenser, the younger, could barely stand. The Chronicles say he had stopped eating, perhaps hoping to cheat the executioner through starvation. They dragged him upright and bound his hands. Edward watched as they separated him from the man who had dominated his court and his heart for more than a decade. He must have known in that moment that he would never see Despenser again. They took Edward under heavy guard to Kenilworth Castle, Henry of Lancaster's stronghold in the Midlands. His fate remained uncertain. He was still the anointed king, crowned and consecrated before God. Killing him would be regicide, a mortal sin with consequences no one could predict. But keeping him alive posed dangers of its own. Despenser received no such consideration. They hauled him to Hereford, where Isabella and Mortimer waited. The man who had accumulated more wealth and power than any subject in England, who had controlled access to the king, who had crushed his enemies without mercy, was now utterly helpless. He arrived in chains, starving, broken, knowing exactly what awaited him in the city where his judges had already pronounced their verdict. They tried Hugh Despenser in Hereford on the 24th of November before a tribunal that had already decided his fate. The charges filled pages: treason against the realm, corruption of royal justice, piracy on the seas, the unlawful execution of noble enemies, and the most personal accusation of all, that he had poisoned the marriage between the king and queen, that he had approached Isabella with threats and driven her from her rightful place. Despenser was not permitted to speak in his own defense. They dragged him through the streets in a crown of nettles, a mockery of the royal favor he had enjoyed. They hanged him from a gallows 50 feet high until his face purpled and his legs kicked. Then they cut him down, still breathing. What followed was methodical destruction. They castrated him while he lived, the Chronicles connecting this mutilation explicitly to his unnatural relationship with the king. They sliced open his belly and burned his entrails before his fading eyes. Finally, they took his head and hacked his body into quarters to be displayed in cities across England. Isabella and Mortimer watched from a raised platform. The hostile chroniclers claimed the queen dined while the execution proceeded, eating and drinking as her enemy was unmade piece by piece. Whether truth or propaganda, this detail would feed the legend of the she-wolf for centuries. Despenser was destroyed. The king was a prisoner. But Edward still wore the crown, and removing an anointed monarch was something England had never done. Isabella and Mortimer had conquered a kingdom, but they faced a problem no one in English history had ever solved. How do you remove an anointed king? The crown was not a garment to be stripped away. It was sacred, placed upon Edward's head by the Archbishop of Canterbury with holy oil and ancient prayers. Monarchy flowed from God, not from subjects. To depose a king was to challenge the divine order itself. Yet Edward could not be allowed to rule. They summoned a parliament to meet at Westminster in January 1327. This was technically illegal, since only the king could call Parliament into session. But Edward was a prisoner at Kenilworth, and in no position to object. The assembly gathered to debate a question without precedent. Could a king be compelled to surrender his throne? If he refused, could he be stripped of it by force? Isabella played her role carefully, presenting herself as the wronged wife and devoted mother who had acted only to save England from the Despensers. Her son was the legitimate heir. The transition could be peaceful and orderly if Edward cooperated. Delegations traveled to Kenilworth bearing the Articles of Accusation, a long catalogue of Edward's failures and crimes. They offered him a choice: abdicate voluntarily in favor of his son, or watch his son be disinherited, and the crown offered to someone outside the bloodline entirely. It was probably a bluff, but Edward, alone and broken, could not know that for certain. The delegation arrived at Kenilworth on the 20th of January, a carefully assembled display of the realm's unified will. Bishops in their vestments, barons in their finery, representatives of the towns and commons who had never before stood in judgment of a king. They found Edward dressed in black, the color of mourning for his own reign. He wept openly as they read the charges against him. The men before him had once knelt and sworn sacred oaths of fealty. Now they had come to unmake him. William Trussell stepped forward as Proctor of Parliament and spoke the words that severed 20 years of rule. On behalf of the entire kingdom, he renounced the homage owed to Edward as king. Then Sir Thomas Blount, steward of the royal household, raised his staff of office and broke it in two. The symbol of royal authority snapped like dry kindling. Edward's household was dissolved. His reign was ended. The Chronicles say Edward collapsed, fainting from the weight of what was happening. When he recovered, he spoke through his tears. He acknowledged his failures. He expressed sorrow that he had lost the love of his people. He agreed to abdicate in favor of his son. It was finished. For the first time in English history, a king had been formally deposed. The precedent would echo through centuries, invoked when Richard II fell and when Charles I faced his judges. Edward was led away, no longer a king, only a prisoner waiting to learn his fate. Westminster Abbey blazed with candles on the 1st of February as the 14-year-old Edward III walked toward his coronation. Incense hung thick in the cold air. Latin chanting rose from the choir and echoed against ancient stone. The boy knelt before the Archbishop of Canterbury and felt the holy oil touch his forehead, his chest, his hands. They placed the crown upon his head, and the weight of it pressed down on a child who had watched his father weep and surrender just days before. Outside the abbey, the crowds cheered for their new king. Inside, the nobility acclaimed him with raised voices and bowed heads. The ceremony was traditional, elaborate, designed to project an unbroken legitimacy stretching back through centuries. But everyone present understood the truth behind the pageantry. Edward III was a boy. The real power stood behind him. Isabella was named regent, her authority now formal and recognized. Roger Mortimer held no official title, but controlled the government nonetheless. The dispenser lands were redistributed, vast estates flowing into Mortimer's hands. Exiled nobles returned to reclaim their positions. Treaties were negotiated with France and Scotland. On the surface, the new regime appeared stable and just. Beneath the surface, the old patterns were already repeating. Mortimer took the title Earl of March. He accumulated wealth with naked greed. He treated the young king with barely concealed condescension. The barons watched and remembered why they had marched against the dispensers. They had not overthrown one tyrant to crown another. They moved Edward from Kenilworth in the spring, taking him further from London and further from hope. Berkeley Castle rose from the Gloucestershire marshes, remote and damp, its stone walls thick enough to swallow screams. His new jailers were Thomas Lord Berkeley and John Maltravers, men with no love for the former king and every reason to please the new regime. The Chronicles describe conditions designed to break him. They say Edward was kept in a chamber above the castle cesspit, the stench of human waste rising through the floor to sicken and weaken him day after day. Whether this is truth or propaganda, crafted by later enemies of Isabella, remains unclear. What is certain is that Edward was meant to be forgotten. He was not forgotten. In July, a Dominican friar named Thomas Dunheved led a band of loyalists who actually managed to free the former king, spiriting him away from Berkeley in a brief, desperate escape. They recaptured him within days, but the damage was done. Isabella and Mortimer now understood that as long as Edward breathed, he remained a rallying point. Other plots surfaced through the summer: whispered conspiracies, secret messages, men who remembered their oaths and wondered if perhaps the anointed king might be restored. The pressure mounted with each failed rescue. They could not hold Edward forever. They could not release him. They could not execute him publicly without outraging the Pope and every crowned head in Europe. Edward sat alone in his cell, understanding with terrible clarity that his continued existence was merely a problem waiting to be solved. On the night of September 21st, in the year 1327, Edward II died at Berkeley Castle. The official announcement claimed natural causes: a sudden illness, a failure of the heart, an act of God striking down the former king in his sleep. No one believed it. The chronicler Geoffrey Le Baker, writing decades later, recorded the account that would burn itself into historical memory. He claimed that men came to Edward in the darkness, held him down upon his bed, and inserted a red-hot iron into his bowels through a horn. The horn left no external marks upon the body. The method, if true, was a grotesque symbolic punishment for the unnatural acts his enemies attributed to his relationships with Gaveston and dispensers. Some chronicles claim that screams echoed from the castle that night, terrible sounds that carried to the village below and woke the sleeping peasants. Whether this is truth or legend, shaped by centuries of retelling, no one can say with certainty. What is certain is that Edward died suddenly and conveniently at exactly the moment his continued existence had become intolerable to the regime. Lord Berkeley would later swear he was not present that night and knew nothing of how the death occurred. John Maltravers fled England shortly after and stayed away for years. The men who knew the truth carried it to their own graves. The autumn darkness, the cold stone walls, the sounds that may or may not have pierced the night. 7 centuries later, we still cannot see clearly into that chamber where an anointed king met his end. They displayed Edward's body at Berkeley Castle so that witnesses could confirm the former king was truly dead. Then they carried him to Gloucester Abbey for burial with the honors befitting his rank. The funeral was a pageant of propriety. Latin prayers filled the vaulted space. Incense smoke curled toward heaven. Candles flickered against the stone as monks chanted the offices for the dead. The young Edward III, 15 years old, watched his father's body lowered into the tomb. Isabella stood nearby in widow's black, her face composed, her thoughts unreadable. They would carve an effigy for the tomb, showing Edward in royal regalia, serene and dignified, his alabaster features peaceful in eternal rest. Nothing like the broken prisoner who had died in that chamber at Berkeley. Nothing like the screaming figure of the Chronicles. No investigation followed the funeral. No charges were brought. No one was officially held responsible for the death of an anointed king. Isabella and Mortimer proceeded as if Edward had simply succumbed to natural causes and the matter required no further attention. But the whispers would not stop. Throughout England, people spoke of murder. The Pope sent letters demanding explanations. Foreign courts expressed shock and suspicion. The legend of the she-wolf crystallized in these months, fed by rumor and horror and the silence that answered every question. What did Isabella feel as she stood beside that tomb? Relief that the threat was ended? Guilt for what she had sanctioned? Triumph over the man who had humiliated her for 17 years? The sources do not tell us. Her heart remains locked behind 7 centuries of silence. The liberation became a tyranny so gradually that few noticed until the chains were already locked. With Edward II dead and buried, Isabella and Mortimer ruled England through the teenage king, and Mortimer's appetite for power proved bottomless. He accumulated estates worth more than any nobleman in the realm. He walked beside Edward III in public ceremonies as though they were equals. He sat at the royal table and addressed the young king with barely concealed condescension. In 1328, he negotiated the Treaty of Edinburgh, recognizing Scottish independence and abandoning decades of English claims. The military class that had bled for those claims watched in fury as Mortimer signed away their sacrifices. Then came the killing that shattered any pretense of legitimacy. Edmund, Earl of Kent, the former king's half-brother, was entrapped by rumors that Edward II still lived. When Edmund acted on these whispers, he was arrested and executed for treason. A royal prince, beheaded on Mortimer's orders. The nobility looked at each other and recognized the pattern. They had not destroyed the dispensers to create another monster. Isabella remained at Mortimer's side through all of it, sharing his power, sharing his bed, her reputation darkening with each of his crimes. Whether she endorsed his excesses or found herself trapped by dependence, the Chronicles do not say. Meanwhile, the young king was growing. In 1330, Edward III turned 17. Old enough to rule, old enough to resent. He began meeting secretly with trusted companions, speaking in whispers about how a king might reclaim his own throne. The coup came on the night of October 19th at Nottingham Castle. Edward III had planned it in secret with 24 young nobles who shared his determination to rule his own kingdom. They knew the castle, knew its hidden passages, knew that Mortimer kept the keys to every gate close at hand. But there was one passage Mortimer did not control. a tunnel running beneath the fortress walls that bypassed every guard he had posted. In the darkness, they crept through that ancient corridor and emerged inside the castle. They moved swiftly to Mortimer's chambers and burst through the door with swords drawn. They found him in bed. Some chronicles say Isabella was beside him. Mortimer fought back, killing 2 of the attackers before they overwhelmed him and bound his hands. Isabella cried out to her son. The chronicles preserved her words across 7 centuries. "Fair son, have pity on the gentle Mortimer." Edward ignored her. The coup took less than an hour. No battle, no civil war, just a surgical strike that ended 4 years of rule by a man who had grown too arrogant to see the blade coming. They took Mortimer to London and tried him before Parliament on charges that included the murder of Edward II. The first official acknowledgement that the former king had been killed rather than dying naturally. Mortimer was not permitted to speak in his defense. On November 29th, they hanged him at Tyburn and left his body swinging for 2 days. Isabella watched from a window as they led him away. She never saw him again. Edward III did not execute his mother. He did not imprison her or strip her of dignity. Instead, he assigned her an income of £3,000 per year and a comfortable residence at Castle Rising in Norfolk. She was removed from power, but not from life. For 28 years, Isabella existed in this strange twilight, neither prisoner nor queen, watched but not punished. She kept a household of servants and attendants. She received visitors from the court. She attended family celebrations when invited, watching her grandchildren grow, watching her son become the warrior king who would claim the throne of France and shatter French armies at Crécy. She collected books and fine things. The records suggest she grew increasingly pious as the years accumulated, perhaps seeking reconciliation with a God who had witnessed everything she had done. She died in 1358 at approximately 63 years old, having outlived her husband by 31 years, her lover by 28. They buried her in her wedding dress, the gown she had worn as a 12-year-old bride at Boulogne. And on her chest, they placed a silver casket containing the heart of Edward II. The woman who had destroyed her husband wished to spend eternity with his heart resting above her own. Was this guilt seeking forgiveness across the grave? Was it a performance of widowly devotion for those who would judge her? Was it something stranger and more private that we cannot access? The Chronicles do not tell us. Isabella took her reasons into the silence of the tomb. The chroniclers began shaping Isabella's legend before her body was cold. Geoffrey Le Baker called her Jezebel after the biblical queen whose name meant wickedness incarnate. Jean Froissart, writing for audiences who craved scandal, emphasized her adultery with Mortimer while dismissing her political grievances as mere pretexts for lust and ambition. The name that stuck hardest was She-Wolf of France, an image of savage, unnatural femininity, a creature who had devoured her own mate. The language tells us as much about medieval anxieties as about Isabella herself. Queens were meant to be ornamental, fertile, silent. They were meant to produce heirs and pray for their husbands and accept whatever treatment they received. Isabella had invaded a kingdom, deposed an anointed monarch, and taken a lover while her husband still lived. She had exercised power with the same ruthlessness that male rulers deployed routinely. But when men crushed their enemies, they were called strong. When Isabella did the same, she was called unnatural. Modern historians have begun constructing a counter-narrative. They point to 17 years of humiliation, to favorites who stole her position and threatened her safety, to a husband who failed every duty a king owed his realm. They argue that Isabella's actions, while brutal, may have been the only available response to an impossible situation. Perhaps she was a political genius demonized by those who could not accept female power. Perhaps she was exactly the monster the Chronicles described. The evidence supports multiple readings. The ambiguity is part of what makes her story endure across 7 centuries of retelling. The question has haunted historians for 7 centuries. Did Isabella kill her husband? The evidence for murder rests on circumstances too convenient to ignore. Edward died suddenly at exactly the moment his continued existence had become a threat to the regime. Mortimer controlled the jailers at Berkeley Castle. The rescue attempts had proven that loyalists would keep trying to free the former king. No investigation followed the death. No punishment was dealt. And when Edward III finally brought Mortimer to justice, the charges explicitly included the murder of Edward II. Contemporaries believed it was murder. But there are those who argue Edward never died at Berkeley at all. A document called the Fieschi Letter, supposedly written by a papal notary, claims Edward escaped and wandered Europe as a hermit. It says he traveled to Avignon, to Cologne, to Milan, finally settling in a hermitage in Lombardy, where he died in obscurity. Some historians have taken this letter seriously, arguing that the escape attempts succeeded and the body displayed at Berkeley belonged to someone else. Most scholars dismiss the Fieschi Letter as forgery or fantasy. The weight of evidence suggests Edward was murdered that September night, probably on Mortimer's orders, almost certainly with Isabella's knowledge. But certainty remains impossible. Lord Berkeley claimed ignorance. Maltravers fled and kept his silence. The men who knew the truth carried it to their own graves. We are left with chronicles written decades later by men with agendas of their own. The darkness of that chamber at Berkeley has never fully lifted. Return to the beginning. A woman stands on the deck of an invasion ship, her teenage son beside her, sailing to destroy the husband she had married as a child of 12. She crossed the channel with fewer than 2,000 men and conquered a kingdom. She deposed an anointed king for the first time in English history. She ruled for 4 years and survived her own fall, dying peacefully in her bed nearly 3 decades later. Isabella was wronged. 17 years of humiliation, of favorites who stole her place, of a husband who looked through her as if she were glass. She was also complicit in that husband's death and in the tyranny that followed. She was victim and perpetrator, liberator and despot. The moral simplicity we crave from history dissolves when we look closely at her story. She chose power over submission, revenge over reconciliation, her son's future over her husband's life. Whether those choices were justified depends on frameworks we are still debating 7 centuries later. At Gloucester Cathedral, Edward II lies in effigy, crowned and serene in alabaster. The Greyfriars Church where Isabella was buried is gone, destroyed in the 16th century. The church where Mortimer rested is likewise vanished. The king, the queen, the lover. Their graves have been lost or scattered, their bones dispersed into the anonymous earth. But their story endures. History remembers the she-wolf of France. It is still learning to understand the woman who lived beneath the legend, making impossible choices in a world that offered her no good options, only survival.